Welcome back to another insightful discussion here on the Champions Path, a platform for all things simulation and training for our champions in the military, law enforcement, and other emergency responder roles. I'm here with Todd Brown, Vice President of TI Training, a simulation solution provider known for their Recon series of projection-based simulators developed for law enforcement and the MVT military virtual training variant. Todd, welcome to the podcast. I appreciate you coming on.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, really excited. TI Training has a well-deserved reputation in the industry. And to really kick things off, could you share the story behind the company and its rise in the simulation training industry?
We started our company in 2006, June 1st, 2006 to be exact. And it was four of us who put together a business plan. We approached a few banks to get a small SBA loan to get it off the ground. We bet our houses and every penny we could ever save. Or that we had saved, to create a simulation company that had one focus, and that was the men and women who rely on this type of training to be safer. It was a huge cliff to jump off of. And I'm not sure if you remember the economy in 2006, 2007, 2008. It was a risky time to start a business. But I've got three of the greatest partners in the world. I think one of the reasons we really made it succeed was because when we designed our simulator, we didn't really design it. We went out to the end users and said, what do you need a simulator to do for you and your personnel? And then we went to the big, smart, egghead programmer guys and said, make it do this. So that kind of collaboration with the customer base right off the start helped us develop a system that is not just economical, but really useful for what the training objectives they need to accomplish. We set our 19th anniversary on June 1st.
Wow, congratulations. That's
Thanks.
really exciting. And I'm a firm believer that simulators aren't here to replace traditional training methods, but rather enhance the engagement of learning through its really unique delivery methods. And some of the main benefits being, high fidelity immersion, near real audio and visual, tactile, et cetera, active learning elements rather than passive environments, and really just overall quality of training material and scenarios that are easily accessible, optimizable, and scalable. And from my experience, and I joined the Marine Corps at 2005, and what I consider as traditional training means either a death by PowerPoint or a period of instruction from a team leader, verbally passing on the knowledge. And then really going down some general route of physical demonstration. Then, the team would conduct dry runs, and at some point we'd go to the field to conduct like maybe a culminating training session on a larger scale, or even more simplistic programs, ending with a written test and even siloed evaluations. And so I'm curious, from your perspective, what does traditional training cycle look like? And how has simulators been able to supplement and augment the training delivery to improve and enhance the training experience?
Well, I think it's not really a new concept. It's new technologies applied to an old concept that we've known really for thousands of years. I think it was Aristotle, and somebody may correct me, but it's famous for the quote, I hear, I forget, I see, I remember, I do, I learn. And simulators really fit in the third part. A practical application of all of that training and knowledge that you're provided in the classroom is distilled down to a training evolution on the simulator to let you actually apply that knowledge. And then an after action review and tools to do that to see how well it was performed. There's a book written by a gentleman named Daniel Coyle called The Talent Code. And I'm paraphrasing here. I'm sure I'm not going to get the quote correct, but he essentially says failure is not an option. It's neurologically required to get better at any skill set. And the simulator is a safe place if you're going to make a mistake to make that mistake, dissect it, and apply Daniel Coyle's concept of deep practice, which is, hey, let's examine that mistake. Why did it occur? How did it occur? And if necessary, repeat the scenario and try it again. Until we gain a level of competency at that training objective to allow you then to move on to the next stage of training. Well, originally, when simulators hit the market in the 80s, they were FATS machines, firearms training systems, right? And it was really, people would talk about it, shoot, no shoot training. The technology and simulators have evolved to where we can put you in any situation. And it's more about decision making. With the information at hand, what decision are you going to make next, and what path might that take you down, and then what decisions you need to make after that. So really, you can almost think of simulators as decision-making trainers. Hey, I'm going to make this decision to do A. The result might be B. The added benefit of being able to apply all the real-world kinesthetics, how you draw your weapon, how you hold your weapon, how do I draw my taser versus my OC, versus a firearm. All that practical application, we know just as trainers, the more you do it, the better and more efficient you get at it. So simulators have evolved to really encompass the entire training realm. So yeah, we can sit in the classroom and learn this, but unless we have that practical application of that skill set, whatever it is, or be forced to make that decision in real time, we can never say that we're competent at it. So that's what simulators, I think, are really where they really shine.
Yeah, that's a good point. So let's say I'm an organization that's just purchased one of the TI simulators. I see simulations in a general sense as, multifaceted, multi-tool. They can be used to demonstrate concepts by an instructor to the audience. They can be used in a crawl, walk, run fashion by progressively building up to complex scenarios by slowly introducing stressors and other environmental cues, as well as as in that culminating pressure testing platform for evaluation and lessons learned. So at what point within the training cycle are TI simulators most used or most effectively used?
One of the powers of the simulator is we found it's throughout the entire training cycle. So let's say you're in the academy, right? One of the challenges for a student at the academy is something a lot of people don't think about, but how do I write an effective report? So we've had simulators used at the academy where they put an academy student through a scenario in the morning, and then they go about their normal academy day. And then before the class is dismissed at the end of the day, the training sergeant will come in and say, okay, good job, Jared. Remember that scenario you went through this morning? Your homework tonight is go home and write a report on that incident as if it actually happened. Then the next day they all show up, everyone's got their report written, and they can dissect those reports to make sure you glean the important elements of it. It didn't happen unless it was written down. It happened exactly how we wrote it down. So they use it as a tool to hone report writing skills. Then we get into in-service, and it can be used to not only evaluate the officers, are they making the decisions we want them to make? Do they understand our policy and procedure? But it can also be used to foresee problems that we might anticipate. If there's a certain thing happening in another city, we see it moving towards our city, can we prepare our officers to deal with those situations ahead of time by giving them practice at dealing with those situations on the simulator? So it can be used very proactively in that sense, not just reactively. Our customers have a lifetime license to our scenario library. We have a full-time video production staff that they make scenarios 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year. Wow. And we release those to all of our customers every 6 months. So we rely heavily on those customers to tell us, hey, I need this scenario that reaches this training objective. We produce it and we share it with all of our customers. Some of that is, hey, this incident happened at our agency last month. We'd like to recreate it so we can show our officers how to best handle it. Other times it's, hey, we anticipate this might happen. So can you create a scenario for us so we can start to train to that before it happens to one of our guys? History is a great teacher, but we can also anticipate a few things as well. Once again, another great thing about a simulation system is we can get it to do what you need it to do. So you at your agency, XYZ department, you have a way of training your guys. Well, the simulator, you can almost think of it as a crescent wrench, right? It's a tool you can use for multiple uses. How we use that tool is just as important as the tool itself. So if you were to purchase our simulator, you spend several days with one of our instructors, not just learning how to set it up, calibrate it, and operate it, because that's the easy part. I mean, anyone who can click a mouse can run a simulator. But the vast majority of that instruction time with our instructor is you learning how to become the best instructor you can be in the simulated environment. In other words, once you identify an objective, how can you use our tool to help your people reach that objective.
Mm-hmm.
Because as good as the technology is, it's only as good as the instructor running it. As an example, agencies will spend a lot of money sending guys to firearms school to become a firearms instructor. They'll send them to defensive tactics school to become a defensive tactics instructor, or EVOC school to become a driving instructor. And a lot of them will purchase a simulator and go, okay, well, hey, you're the simulation instructor now, without any real knowledge of that training environment and how to utilize this tool to its greatest advantage according to the way you train. So we spend a lot of time in our training class with those instructors, whatever their discipline may be, defensive tactics, firearms, whatever it is, making them the best instructor in the simulated environment they can possibly be.
So many incredible points. And I do want to go back to the fact that for thousands of years, and you brought this up, thousands of years we've been operating as just a human species of master apprentice, instructor, trainee, teacher, student. And before these simulation systems, we were geographically restricted. And you had brought up, maybe an agency had an experience and there's immense amount of training value, but there wasn't that dissemination of knowledge or sharing of that information. And it's incredible that you guys are continuously creating these scenarios based off of user feedback, utilizing these scenarios that are designed from your end users and geographically disseminating it. And so that's incredible. And I've heard you say, as well as a lot of seasoned instructors have also said, the real training begins once the scenario has ended. Mm-hmm. What do you mean by that?
You just reminded me of another old saying that I remember, which is, good judgment comes from experience and experience comes from bad judgment. Sometimes we learn more by doing it wrong. But you're absolutely right. The real training begins when the scenario ends, which means at that point, the scenario's played out how it's played out. Now I can turn around with my instructor and say, well, here's why I did A instead of B. And we see that result. And the instructor might, well, what if you did D or E or F instead? How might that have affected it? And rather than just being a thought exercise, we can go, you know what, let's try it and replay the scenario and see not just what was successful, but what was less than successful. Because there is no one-size-fits-all solution to a contact with someone as a police officer, right? So we want to give them a variety of tools and approaches to something where this might work 90% of the time, but that's only 90%. What about the other 10%? So once the scenario is complete, those discussions start to happen and where the real learning takes place, because now it's not just one-sided, you will do A, B, and C, Jared. It's, no, you know what? Let's try A, B, and C. Let's try X, Y, and Z too. See how that affects things. And what we found is that one-size-fits-all approach not only just doesn't work in the real world, but it may not work for Jared, right? I'm going to go, Jared, hey, try it this way because this is the way we do it. But that doesn't work for you. Well, you know what? My job as the instructor is to help you investigate with the simulator. Hey, let's try some different ways of doing that particular skill set, whether it's a decision that you're making, whether it's drawing your weapon, whether it's how you take cover and concealment, whatever our objective is for that day. We're going to try a few different ways and find out what works for Jared and our policy and procedure. So the scenario might be a minute long, and then we could spend 20 minutes in an after-action review debriefing that scenario and maybe even trying it a few more times with a few different approaches to see not only what works for you, but what gives us, and in law enforcement world in particular, we're looking for what can give us the quickest, safest resolution to any problem. But we can certainly give you a tool bag to choose from to go, hey, I know this might work. Let me try that first.
Yeah, I really like that human-centric design and trainees at the center of training. And we can go into that here in a moment, but I do want to go back to the systems themselves. We've touched on the benefits of what simulators provide. TI provides a multitude of projection-based simulators, from the single screen, the 180, the 300, as well as I think I saw even a shoot house
Correct.
simulation system. What's the strategy behind the multiple systems? And if you can go into,
Absolutely.
what's the differences? Yeah.
So we started with, or we actually also now have an LED system too, where we've
Mm-hmm.
gotten rid of projectors entirely. When
Mm-hmm.
we're using LED walls to display the video, which allows us to do 4K or better in video now. Traditionally, a simulator was a single screen, single projector. Our simulators, the name of our simulators is the Recon family of simulators. Our single screen system is the Recon Core. That's the name we've given it because it's the brains that can do everything else. With our multi-screen systems, we actually have this patented. We have the ability to move the screens in the training room or even place them in different locations in the training room for a couple of reasons. First is it still allows for realistic movement. So our 300-degree simulator you mentioned earlier, it's our 5-screen simulator. And traditionally, a multi-screen simulator like that, you had 5 connected screens, almost like that wrapped around the trainee. And the trainee stood in the middle. And one of the problems with that, at least from a real-world physical standpoint, is really the only movement you get from your officer then who's going through that simulation is they'd stand there in the center and kind of turn around and spin like a top, looking at whatever screen needed their attention. By being able to move the screens to different locations, we can now allow for realistic movement in that training room, where I'm not just standing in one spot. I'm able to physically move maybe from screen to screen to do my job. And the second, and just as important, is by being able to move the screens, we can provide of that location that we're displaying on the screens. So imagine for a second you had a 180-degree simulator, so you had 3 screens wrapped around you, and we displayed you in the middle of a room. Well, that would make sense because you can look to your left, you can see that part of the room, look to your right, see that part of the room, look straight ahead, see that part of the room. But if we now wanted to display you in a parking lot and you're standing in the middle of those 3 screens, it would appear there was a parking lot wrapped around you. And your brain would go, what am I looking at here? That's not very natural. So in our system, we could take those outer 2 screens, lay them flat, so now you have a panoramic view of the parking lot, which your brain is telling you that's what it should look like if I'm standing in a parking lot.
Right.
So we have not only the 180 system, the 300 system, things like that, but we can do up to 27 screens all run from one instructor station.
Wow.
That means in the building you're in now, we could put screens in different rooms and we could move you from room to room, right? Dealing with different situations on different screens. So now you're moving in a real space and you're seeing things displayed as they should be. This led us to the sim house. The sim house is movable walls that interlock with pins. Our walls are marking cartridge rated, so you're not doing simulation training. You can do force on force marking cartridge training with the sim house. But it's a similar concept. Rather than standing in the middle of a simulator, in the sim house, you're actually moving from room to room. You're moving through the simulator, and as you walk through, the projectors turn on and project that portion of the simulation as you're moving through the sim house. So you could then simulate a school, an office, middle of the convenience store. You're moving through a physical space. As you know, being a Marine, right, there's a difference between thinking about moving through real space and actually, for example, having a rifle out in front of you and trying to maneuver around a corner. So this is true kinesthetic sense or kinesthetic movement combined with the simulation aspect of decision making, processing information, making a decision about what to do next, and seeing how that your decision affects or may affect what happens next.
That is incredible, and I suspect that some of these simulation providers are dabbling in VR and AR. And I know TI combines AR capabilities with your projection-based systems. And I find it incredibly interesting because, again, some of the other solution providers are offering similar scenarios, but in a virtual reality platform. And you brought up, the improvements of the resolution with LED screens. And so I'm curious, and I suspect within VR, is there the concept of pixelation distortion, and you're talking about the kinesthetic movements and the realistic manipulation of weapons. And so, why does TI go the AR route versus VR?
It's a really good and interesting question because we've heavily investigated both routes. The truth is, again, there's not a one-size solution that fits all. However, like many things in life, sometimes something's greatest strength is also its greatest weakness, depending on the application. Let me explain. One of its greatest strength is, and if you've ever experienced a VR game or anything like that, it's completely immersive, right?
Mm-hmm.
You put that headset on and you are in that world. It's pretty impressive. However, as soon as I put on a VR headset, I'm in the headset and I've blocked myself out from the real world. This immediately provides a problem with realistic movement, right? Because, and you can YouTube the videos of people running into walls and smacking into things with a VR headset on. And for us, when a police officer lives, breathes, works, and operates in the real world, we need to be able to move and move realistically. Some of the other issues that with VR, and although it's getting better, I mean, graphics have never been as good as they are now. However, even the best graphics in the world don't do a really good job of portraying how we as human beings communicate most often, which is through micro expressions, right? We communicate very, very much non-verbally. Mm-hmm. So even now, as I watch you on the screen and I see you slightly nodding your head, it tells me that you're understanding what I'm trying to convey. Or if I see you furrow your brow, maybe you want to start a fight, or we can glean a lot from micro expressions, and video still does the best job of conveying that nonverbal communication. And then thirdly, with VR, if I have a weapon or let's say a taser and I want to place it in front of my face, I see a computer-generated image of that taser in the VR headset. And a lot of the feedback we've gotten, and I've noticed this myself, is you kind of have to hold it at a weird spot to get it to line up in your headset, which may not be in the actual spot where your normal mount for that weapon platform. So that led us down the AR route, because with augmented reality, just like its name implies, you put on that headset. However, I can still see the real world. I'm looking through a pair of glasses, right? So I can still move and move realistically. If I do put that taser out in front of me, I see my taser, my hands, because I still have a connection to the real world. And what we're doing is we're augmenting that training space with either graphics or what's called volumetric video of people and objects in that training space with me. So a couple of examples of that might be a dumpster that appears in the center of the room that I can actually kneel behind and feel like I'm taking cover while I engage the screen behind it. Or a volumetric video, we could take Jared, we could put you on our volumetric capture stage, 5 cameras around you, we film you, and then when we display you in the headset, you appear to be standing in the center of the room. I can walk up, walk around you, just like I would if you were really standing in the middle of the room. So augmented reality really allowed us, I guess the shortest, easiest way to say it is, it allowed us to keep a tie and keep training in the real world rather than some alternate reality. Now, VR has great applications, don't get me wrong. One of the best driving simulators I ever saw was a VR headset with a motion seat. And a lot of people who get sick on driving simulators don't get sick in the VR driving simulator because I'm immersed in that headset and the seat is moving me appropriately with the inputs I'm giving the steering wheel. So VR has great applications. Just for what we do, augmented reality was a much better fit.
Yeah, what great insight and great points. And so, I love that these simulators really put the trainee at the center of training. I want to go to the human-centric design that you had brought up. And so, for example, one of the ways that simulators do this is by catering to varying levels of competency, where maybe a less seasoned user can grasp, maybe the fundamentals, and inexperienced trainee can refine their skills. And by delivering a system with hundreds of scenarios, with thousands of branching options, I surmise that TI's courseware caters to a wide range of experience levels. Would this be a true assumption?
I think it's a very true assumption. We create a scenario. It's not TI creating it. Jared at your police department telling us, hey, I need a scenario. And typically what we'll do is we'll go, okay, Jared tells Todd, I need a scenario that does this, this, and this. And I said, Jared, you just identified 5 different scenarios. So let's distill it down to the training objective you're trying to reach. We'll design a scenario then with branching options that help you get that officer to that training objective. So you mentioned, new officer to a seasoned officer.
Right.
back to the idea of experience, right? One of the great things about a simulator, and we worked, there used to be an organization called the Rural Law Enforcement Training Center. And it was run by a gentleman named Scott Barker. And Scott was a former FBI guy. And he was one of the first guys in the country to realize, the only difference between an officer in small town Kentucky and an officer at NYPD is an experience level. In other words, the NYPD officer might learn in 2 years on the job what it takes the small town Kentucky officer 10 years to learn. Because that New York officer is exposed to a greater number, variety of calls in a much more compressed time frame. And simulation was a great way to bridge that gap, where we could put that smaller agency officer on a simulator and let him experience a situation that did happen in New York City, for example. And so now they file that away. They go, okay, I've experienced this before. When I'm presented with similar circumstances, I know which path to start moving down. And I already mentioned, from the academy level to special SWAT teams or special applications units, they're going to have different objectives based on what that officer does for that agency. So a patrol level officer, I might have just received my lecture for critical incident training, right? Commonly referred to as de-escalation training. Well, that's great, but until I have an opportunity to apply what I learned in that class, I don't know that I've applied it correctly to be effective or not. Well, the simulator can be a great place to get that experience versus a SWAT team member where they're much more concerned about team movement or things like that. Well, we can put them in the sim house and have them move through and evaluate their performance in that environment. I mean, if you really think about it, at any law enforcement agency, there's a huge, although they're all police officers, there's a huge variety of jobs and what their job entails. And so a simulator is a great utility tool to reach each one of those guys for what they do for their agency.
Yeah, really good equalizer. And, working with the organizations and agencies in scenario design, I do want to delve, maybe into the concepts of building effective scenarios. And, you had mentioned training objectives, and the military is obsessed with TLOs and ELOs, these terminal learning objectives,
right,
being the overarching goal of the training program, and enabling learning objectives being these stepping stones, to obtain the terminal objective. And so, for example, a TLO might be rifle qualification, and ELOs would consist of, proper breathing techniques and trigger control and sight picture, sight alignment, et cetera. And so what's the strategy behind building out, TI's hundreds of scenarios?
Initially, it might start with an email to Todd going, hey, Todd, we want a scenario that does this. Or we like this one scenario you have. We wish it did this as well. So we'll create a scenario that does that part. But I wish I could tell you how many times I've received an email that said, hey, Todd, I want a scenario with a fire truck and ninjas coming down the side of the building and a helicopter. It's going to look great. Don't get me wrong. But what's your objective? What's this scenario going to do to help that officer? And that's where we really distill it down to, okay, we're going to create this scenario for this particular objective. An example is we have a scenario in our system where you're rear guard on an active shooter, or you're on the perimeter guarding the back of a building during an active shooter, and a guy pops out with a rifle and starts shooting at you. And if you do what we've all trained to do, you start shooting center mass, you realize it's ineffective because this guy's wearing body armor. So the whole objective of the scenario is to see, will you recognize that and go somewhere else with your shot placement? It's a very quick, very easy scenario, only has a few branches in it, but a very well-defined and important training objective, right? Because it's one of the definitions of insanity. Well, are you going to keep repeating the same behavior, expecting a different result, or will you do something else?
Right.
Then we have other scenarios that require many more branches in order to get to that objective. So a way to think about this is once we have the objective defined, that tells us how many branch options we need to provide in that scenario for Jared to get his officer to that objective. So it starts with that initial contact, hey, I want a scenario that does this. Then we really delve down, define that training objective. Then we do a thing called storyboarding where we take that objective, we map it out on a piece of paper, almost like a flow chart with each and every branch option we're going to need and where we're going to need them for that scenario. and our video production crew is really good at this now, then they set it up and film it. So by the time that scenario is released, it's very clear what the training objective is. All the branch options that are required are there to are already included to get you there. And then you're simply running the scenario, observing your officer, and branching it down the different pathways based on how they interact with that scenario.
Yeah.
So it ends up becoming really effective.
Excellent. Yeah, and one of the great benefits of these simulators is gradual exposure to stress and stress inoculation. In part, the purpose of the simulation systems is designed to really deliver realistic situations to elicit realistic responses and behavior, replicating the stressors of real world scenarios. And to quote the famous Ken Murray, continually replicate successful results. And so I was having a conversation with Dr. Melise Balban, and she's a neuroscientist from Stanford out of the Huberman Lab and the CEO of NeuroSmart Technology. And we had a conversation on stress and the importance of stress awareness and stress management. And she describes this ideal zone of healthy stress levels to maintain vigilance and an optimized decision-making capabilities. And on the lower spectrum, you have hypovigilance, a state of reduced awareness and reduced response. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have hypervigilance, a state of excessive alertness that could lead to poor concentration and poor decision making. And so thinking about TI's simulations, incorporating accessories like shock systems and injury simulation, gradually expose trainees to additional stress factors and build stress inoculation. Could you go into more details on how these devices are being included?
Yeah, so we have a return fire cannon that'll fire back 50 caliber from rubber walls at you. We have a vest that'll vibrate and light up to let you know that you've been hit. But you mentioned stress, and I'm not a neurologist, right? I'll show you the calluses on my knuckles where I've drug them on the ground my entire life. But we know, like anything else, right? Too little of something is not good, and too much of something is not good. Stress in itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. It needs to be managed and managed correctly. Because stress is one of the things that helps us attain correct amount of vigilance. So on the simulator, if you're brand new to it, and the first time you ever get on a simulator, you will feel your heart rate increase. Well, that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, in our training room over here, we even have a treadmill. So we might put guys on there, make them run a half a mile, then go through their simulation. So there we've induced physical stress, which can help induce mental stress, increase elevated heart rate, and then we see, okay, how well do you normally you score 100% every pistol qualification, how well do you shoot now? So a lot of this is just making that officer aware how that stress might affect their performance and then giving them the tools to mitigate that stress so they can perform optimally. We talk about it all the time, but unless you've actually experienced it, these time frames are super compressed that things happen in the real world. Like 1 or 2 seconds and everything is over. The fight is over. So rather than get overridden and freeze, which is, well, I'm sure when you're in the Marine Corps, there were times just went, and you had to do it again and again before you could figure it out and go, okay, here's how I can do this. That's where a simulator shines. And we rely heavily on all the research like the doctor friend of yours has done. There's a gentleman named Dr. Bill Lewinsky who heads up the Force Science Center and does a lot of research into officer-related encounters, and he shares that research. And so we rely heavily on that research to formulate useful content that is going to aid that instructor and aid that officer in reaching whatever objective they think is important. That answers your question or not? But
yeah, no, it does, because I was reading an article, and there's several peer-reviewed journals that have been published, but this one specifically was the International Journal of Human Computer Studies, and the article concluded that your experience and the sense of presence in being in a realistic situation might not be determined by the technical fidelity, so the hardware, but the psychological and physiological fidelity. So getting the trainees to an emotional state that's similar and to the replicated scenario is in best practice to elicit those emotional responses that one would experience in real life.
Here's another great practical example of what we're talking about. a company, AU Fire, that I'm sure you're familiar with, right? Builds a sleeve, and the sleeve is designed to provide an electric pulse to maybe lock up an arm, for example. So I put the sleeve on here, and that arm is locked up and it's out of commission. So we can incorporate that into the simulator, lock up your dominant arm. Well, how are you going to draw your firearm and engage should you need to? In fact, we developed a specific drill with the AU Fire sleeve for applications of a tourniquet. In this drill, we put you in a simulated gunfight with a bad guy. We lock up, say, your dominant arm. We force you to engage and neutralize that threat. And then afterwards, you have to pull off your tourniquet and you have to apply your tourniquet to yourself. So we time that entire event from the time the gunfight started to you actually have your tourniquet in place. All the while you're fighting this with one arm out of commission to simulate maybe that arm had been shot by the bad guy.
I can't remember who says it, but everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. No plan survives first contact with the enemy. And so, it's a rhetorical question, but would you want to experience an immobilized limb in a gun battle for the first time in a real world situation? And like you had said, that's one of the benefits, is gaining that experience. As novel as it is, again, I wouldn't want the very first time that I've experienced something like that to be in a real world setting. And if we can simulate that to gain that experience, to have the safety net of a restart button to go back and review in the after action lessons learned, and it is quite the advantage.
Well, and it's not always easy, right? Because I'm sure you experience this in the Marine Corps. We certainly see it in law enforcement and just about everywhere. We all have egos, and when that ego gets bruised, it's hard to go, you know what, wait a minute, I did screw that up. How can I do it better? And so a simulator tends to be a great environment to do that in, to go, you know what, I did make a mistake. We're talking about stressors earlier. One of, I used to be, and I'm a great believer in letting others observe you go through your scenario, right? Because nobody wants to screw up in front of their buddies, and it adds another layer of stress. But a lot of times that's very helpful to screw up in front of your buddies, because they've got your best interests at heart. So when the instructor says, hey, Jared, you did A, B, C wrong, and you're going, I don't think so, because I'm pretty friggin' awesome, right? Awesome ends in me, right? I'm Jared, man, I'm tactical. But your buddy goes, no, Jared, you did. You tend to believe your buddy and go, okay, let me try it again. So there's a lot of different ways we can utilize a simulator to get past that ego that we all have and we all battle every day, and we need to set it aside in order to get a little bit better.
I want to shift to a concept that isn't necessarily new, but with the rise of simulation technology, could easily be overlooked in the industry, and it's not talked about often, at least from my perspective. And this concept is metagaming. And metagaming is, in this context of training and developing skills, is using a simulator and simply exploiting the program with knowledge from outside of the simulation to gain an advantage within it. And so, for example, a trainee might memorize the scripted responses during repeated practice runs, and the continuous successful outcomes could be perceived as competency. But in reality, it's just, the trainee really finding a path of least resistance. Right. And so, from your experience, what would be some great strategies for trainers to mitigate metagaming practices, or even testing the appearance of competency?
So back to this concept of an objective. I think one of the most important things for an instructor to do is identify, what is my objective today when I run this, when I turn on the simulator? What is it that I want my officers to learn? What is it I want them to gain a competency at? What is it that I want them walking out this door being able to do that they couldn't do before they came in? So we have well in excess of 1,500 different scenarios in our system. Rather than just bring a guy like Jared in and go, okay, Jared, we're doing these 5 scenarios today so I can check the box that you've done your continuing education requirements to maintain your peace officer certification. It's going into those scenarios and going, what are my objectives? What is it that is important that my officers learn this time? And we can create a playlist of those scenarios. And we may even create 2 or 3 different playlists depending on not only what our objective is at the agency, but what level that officer is at, or what that officer what their specific job is for our agency, and then selecting those scenarios that reach those objectives. I guess another way to put it is the instructor's real work begins before they ever turn on the simulator. That's where the bulk of their work is done. And then being realistic about branching, right? We have the ability to branch the scenario down different paths. Our training director, for example, his name is Rich Isnetto. And Rich is a great believer that, hey, you never let your people lose on the simulator, because we want them walking out of the door with the mindset of, I can do this and I'm okay with this. So I think a trap that a lot of instructors fall into is, Jared has to get 5 scenarios today on the simulator. And that's not true. Jared needs to reach my training objectives. So maybe you're the most squared away guy in our agency. It just requires me 1 scenario to go, yep, he's where he needs to be. The next guy comes through, he might need 5 or 6 scenarios to get to your same level. The next guy who comes through might need that 1 scenario, but he might need it repeated 5 or 6 different times. So I think the most constructive thing an instructor can do to prepare is to go identify the objective first, and then be realistic about that officer, not where you think they are, where you think they should be, or think they should be, but where they actually are and where you need to get them. And we can't do it all in one session.
Right.
If you go to the gym, you're not going to be Arnold Schwarzenegger going one day, right? It's got to be consistent and repeated.
Right.
So you might get a repeat of scenario over 2 or 3 different training sessions. Or you may not see that scenario again until 2 years from now, but we're going to bring you back and say, okay, have you maintained your level of proficiency with that objective over those 2 years?
And so I want to shift to looking at the future. So with the widespread adoption of simulation technology and with the emergence of new systems like machine learning, AI, biofeedback wearable systems, improvements in hardware capabilities, how do you see simulation technology evolving, within the next decade?
I used to think I knew a lot about this. I've been around simulators since the late 90s, back when I used to run an old FATS3 machine, to now with TI. I used to think I knew a lot about it. And one of the things I've learned, I was just telling an agency that was in this morning for a demonstration, I said, somewhere on this planet, there's a punk 18-year-old kid in the dorm room writing code that's going to change everything. We can see with applications of augmented reality, things like LEDs, which get us away from projection altogether and provide another avenue not only for greater fidelity in the video, but have other applications for that agency. Things that I didn't think were possible 5-6 years ago are now coming on here. So one of the things I've learned is I can't always predict the future in simulation. What I can do, and one of the things we try to do at TI, is anything we want to add or help create with the simulator really passes a 2-question test for us. The first one is, does it add training value? If the answer to that is no, we don't even investigate that path anymore. And then the second, and this is our challenge as a company, is can we make it cost effective? Right? Again, 5-6 years ago, augmented reality was kind of a pipe dream, but we're already incorporating it today. LED screens instead of projectors. What would have been a $500,000 simulator 5-6 years ago now is less than $200,000 because those technologies get better, cheaper, faster, stronger. It's an exciting time to be alive and be in this industry because there's so many possibilities.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, maybe there is that kid in a college dorm right now writing code. And I believe that, more analytical tools will be integrated into these systems, just during the after action with. And so I believe the scenario delivery will improve slightly, but the analytics and how these data points are quantified for performance and progression tracking. And so maybe some sort of funnel software will be developed.
Yeah. And that's where we really rely heavily. Like, we can capture all that. I can integrate eye tracking today. I could devices like the Mantis. I know how your gun is oriented, what you're doing with the trigger at any point. Right, all of that. I can capture all of that data. Another exciting part of all this is, and you mentioned that doctor friend of yours, Dr. Lewinsky, finally all this research is being done to tell us, great, you have all this data. What does it mean? And that's where the research really helps us as instructors to go, great, I have all this data. I don't know how to collate it and put it into a meaningful form, but the research guys do that for us and go, okay, here's what this means. And then once I have that information as an instructor, as vice president of TI, I can go, hey, okay, here's what we need to make the simulator do in order to not only capture that data, but help interpret that data for the instructor and the officer.
Todd, this has been an excellent conversation. And so before we conclude, is there any topic you wish to discuss or delve deeper into?
Unless we want to talk about how horrible the Broncos are going to be this year. I'm still a Broncos season ticket holder. I love my Broncos. But
well, Todd, thank you again for your time. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Bye now.
Bye.